Hello, my name is Katie Groves, and I am a survivor of the United States military mind control experimentation and programming. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a phenomenon known as exponential fragmentation and how I've learned to integrate myself from this kind of fragmentation. This is a very challenging video to make, as exponential fragmentation is one of the most traumatizing processes that I've ever experienced during torture-based mind control. But I find it valuable to talk about because, to my knowledge, no one else has. I've yet to find any literature about this subject. And so, to my knowledge, in the English-speaking world at least, my videos I just posted, titled Exponentially Fragmented and Fractaline Dissociative Identity Disorder, Parts 1 and 2, the first of anything to be published on this subject. So I want to share my experience healing from this in the hopes that other survivors or therapists trying to treat survivors who've experienced this could gain some helpful tools in piecing themselves back together. I'd also like to note a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a therapist. I am not a professional of any kind. I'm just a survivor of mind control who has gained hold of their systems and learned how to integrate themselves, largely after having been programmed for the better part of 18 years. So none of this is meant to be taken as professional advice or advice of any kind. I'm simply sharing my experience in the hopes that it may inspire others to find ways to adapt tools I've used or develop their own tools that will work for them. I'd also like to note that if you're not familiar with exponential fragmentation, it simply means splitting indefinitely in exponential sequences. So parts of me were programmed to split continuously and exponentially for years on end. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be indefinite, but that's how it was for me. So that's what I'll be specifically talking about, is how to shut down the splitting for parts that are being split apart continuously, and how to integrate afterwards. In my videos about exponential fragmentation posted previously, I talked about splitting factories, internal dissociative worlds in which parts were split continuously, exponentially for years on end. And so I'm going to talk more about that in this video, and specifically how I've learned to shut the splitting down within those, quote, factories. One of the things I didn't mention in my last videos about splitting factories is that in splitting factories there is typically a core wound where trauma is being relived in dissociative parts. Trauma so severe that it's capable of generating this mechanism to split continuously. One of the trigger codes for me was to split until we felt no more pain. And yet pain was continuously channeled into dissociative parts to keep them splitting, thinking they had to keep splitting till they felt no more pain. So there really was no degree to which we could split to truly stop feeling pain. This is one of the tricks played on us by our abusers. One of the things I've learned to do is to go inside, shut down that core wound, either freeze the trauma so that the parts cannot relive it anymore, and then actually heal the trauma, or remove the trauma from that part, compartmentalize it in a box separate from the factory, and thus make the parts in the system feel like they've gone numb, and that will trigger them to think that they've finally stopped feeling pain, and they'll stop splitting. That's been a really simple way of doing it. Oftentimes, though, I'm unable to access the core wound of the part. It really depends on the self-awareness of the inner programming parts who control the way the system functions. And depending on how much knowledge those parts have, I may have a very limited capacity in what I can do to shut down the splitting. And so that's caused me to try a wide variety of different techniques. Another technique has been to simply freeze the system so that the parts can't split anymore. This can be very painful though, because if the core wound is still activated, then that means these parts will start feeling their pain without release. So I couple freezing the system with dosing the dissociative parts with inner chemicals that will sedate them. I have inner drugstores inside where my inner programmers have given me access to essentially internal experiences of opiates and benzodiazapines that will flood parts of me with calming feelings so that they can be subdued and worked with. They're no longer in such panicked, traumatized states. So I've learned to access these inner reservoirs of chemicals and trigger parts to experience opiate and benzo highs so that they're not in pain, so that I can work with them. So if I'm not able to access the core wound, I'll freeze parts and dose them with inner drugs so that they're not in such pain and torture, simply for the sake of that, but also so that I can work with them in figuring out strategies for piecing them back together. One thing I'd like to note about all of this is that while I like to ideally get dissociative parts consent, I don't like to forcibly integrate them. I want them to have a choice. One of the things that kept exponential fragmentation in place for me is that the parts were so fragmented they were unable to think on their own, unable to think to want to come back together. They were just violently splitting continuously. And even when frozen, these parts were too fragmentary to have real personalities, so they couldn't make the decision to come back together. So I had to a degree, implement force through freezing, drugging, and forcible integration so that I could integrate parts into states where they would have some semblance of personality and capacity for choice. Once I could restructure a system where parts had the power of choice, then, as soon as I would start engaging with those parts in conversation and helping these parts to make the decisions on their own. But if I waited for them to make a choice, it wouldn't have happened. All this would have just continued the way it continued. So I did have to implement some degree of force. Another thing that really helped me with the splitting factories was to talk to inner programmer parts and ask them if we could install a lever or a button that would trigger off a sequence of internal reactions within the splitting factory that would force the system to come back together. So this is forced integration. Once this lever button was installed, I could go inside, simply pull the lever or push the button, and the parts, instead of continuing to split, would rapidly converge back into one part. One of the things I did to make this less traumatic on the system, is this caused a lot of residual trauma when done in full, was to pre-program the parts to be able to shut down the reintegration once they became cognizant of what was happening, once they integrated back together enough to see what was happening, self-reflect, and say, oh my God, this hurts, I don't want to. And that was a great way of getting parts to integrate enough to where I could have a conversation with them and they could choose the pace at which they healed, or whether to heal at all in that moment, without having to go inside and monitor each part individually. I basically gave these parts the ability to self-reflect or to shut it down once they could self-reflect. So installing these parts, giving a part the job of a commander part, that once they became pieced back together, they could shut it down and then talk to me. That really helped. Okay, I'm coming to the end of the length of time I have for this video, but if you join me for my next video, I will keep talking about integration from exponential fragmentation, and I'll talk specifically about an aspect of exponential fragmentation called gridlocking. It is not, to my knowledge, limited to exponential fragmentation, but it was a big part of my programming as an exponential slave, and a big part of what kept all this in place. So I'll explain what gridlocking is, and then I'll talk about tools for deprogramming it and integrating subsequently. Okay, thank you. I hope this was informative. I talked fast because I have so much information that I'm trying to convey, so I hope this wasn't too overwhelming for anyone. Blessings.